The March mood board at Jot magazine included a floral watercolor design, and I wanted to recreate that for my layout, which you can see here. And on this layout, I used just plain textured cardstock. But today, I'm going to show you how you can recreate the same stamped and watercolor floral design on your next project. So I'm working with watercolor paper. I have a pot of water. I have some inexpensive watercolors here and an inexpensive brush. And I also have this floral stamp set from Studio Calico, which I got, I think, a couple of years ago, but it's one that I use quite a lot. And I also have a paper towel just in case there's any mess that I need to tidy up. So I'm using Stampin' Up stamp pads, and these are water-based stamp pads, and that's important so that you can move the color around on your watercolor paper. So I'm going to start with a large flower and the darkest color that I want to use. Now I'm creating the background for a card on this one. So I'm going to do kind of this indigo blue flower. And when I create a design on a background, I typically work in 3s and 5s. So I'm going to go with 5 blue flowers on this background. And I also have my baby wipes handy so that I can clean off my stamps. So next I'm going to dip my paintbrush in my water and make sure I don't have too much water. And I'm just going to lightly drag the color from the flower outside of the flower so that it softens up the edges a bit, but you can still see the stamped image quite clearly. It just makes it so that the edges aren't as sharp. And always when I start out doing this, I feel like it really doesn't look good, and I almost wanted to stop at this point, but don't stop now. It will get better and better as you add more colors and the colors run together a bit on the watercolor paper. Later on in the video, I'll show you the difference in using plain texture cardstock and watercolor paper, but you can see here how easy it is for me to pull the color out. And when you're using a darker ink, like this dark kind of indigo blue, you can usually not add any extra color. You can just stamp your image and then pull the color out because there's such a high saturation of color there. Okay, now that I have all the blue flowers completed, I'm going to clean off my brush and get started on the next flower. This one is going to be a teal with the small flower. And the blue hasn't completely dried yet, so that's why I'm going with teal, because it's the closest thing to that dark blue. So if it does run a tiny bit, it won't really change the color too much. So I'm just going to stamp 3 of those. And I'm just going to show you here, I'm going to put some water on, but when I go to pull out the color, it doesn't really run because the color isn't that vibrant on this teal. So I'm going to go to my watercolor paints and just choose a teal that most closely matches. You can actually, if you're not in a hurry like I am today, actually put a couple of different colors together to match it perfectly. But for what I'm doing right now, this is good enough for me. So by doing that, it's softening up those lines, and I'm just adding some more teal color around the teal flowers. And it mixes quite nicely with the blue as well. Okay, my teal flowers are done, so I'm going to go back to my large flower again and choose pink this time. My blue ink is quite dry by this stage, so I feel confident in going ahead and stamping with the pink. I don't really want to get purple, so that's why I wanted to let my blue dry a bit. And this is quite a light pink. And with the space I have left on this card, I think I'm going to go ahead and do 3 of the pink flowers. Now because this pink is so light, it will also not pull the color out on the paper. So I'm going to choose the lightest pink shade in my watercolor paints. Just make sure that that matches okay. It's always a good idea to have some scrap watercolor paper or whatever paper you're working with just sitting nearby so you can try out something first. So I'm going to use the watercolor paint to soften the edge of the flower, and I'm also going to rub it on the inside of the flower so that it makes that stamped image nice and smooth. And I'm really not using a ton of water here because I really don't want things to run too much together. I don't want one large floral blob on my card. And I'm also going to fill in some of the blank white space with pink. Since I only have 3 of the pink flowers, I'll just add some pink in to the negative space on the card. I think adding the pink gives it quite a feminine touch and just makes it really soft and pretty. So there we go. I think we'll call that completed. And at this stage, I'm going to let my background dry. Okay, what I've done so far is completely dry so that I'm going to stamp on top of what I've already done, and I don't want these stamped images to run. So that's why it was important for me to dry it. I want these images to be crisp and clear. So I'm just going to stamp 3 of the center of the small turquoise flower in the dark blue. And then grab the 3 small dots to stamp in the middle of the large blue flower. And I'm going to go with a darker blue than what I already have on my paper, just so that you can see it. Next up, I'm going to put a dark pink center in my light pink flowers. So I'm just testing out the pinks to make sure I like them first. And then I'm just going to draw the center in. And it might look quite bold here first, but I'm going to let it dry for a few minutes and then soften up those colors. Okay, for the last layer, it's time to add my leaves. And I'm starting out with the solid leaf and the light green because I'm also going to layer my 2 leaf colors. So I'm going to stamp 3 of these at first. but then later on I'm going to go back and change my mind and stamp 5 instead. Sometimes you just have to stand back and look at it to decide. Okay, then I'm going to do the green leaf in a bright green color. Okay, once all my leaves are stamped, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my pink centers and just soften those up a bit, just so the lines aren't so harsh and the color kind of bleeds out a bit into the light pink. And then once I clean my brush, I'm just going to lightly go over my leaves with just a tiny bit of water so that I can soften them up a bit and make that bright green and the soft green run together just a bit more. And that's it for this background. I'm just going to show you the difference between the watercolor paper and the textured cardstock. You can see on the left I used the textured cardstock and the color didn't pull out quite as easily as it did on the watercolor paper. So when you're using watercolor paper, you get a much looser effect. So if that's what you're going for, choose watercolor paper, but by all means, if you only have textured cardstock, you can certainly make this technique work with that. Thank you so much for joining me in this Technique Tuesday video, and I hope you have fun creating your stamped watercolor background. Be sure to follow my feed for more paper crafting and scrapbooking videos.